Hello. According to the clock on the wall back there, it's 2:01, so I'm starting. Well, I'll talk real slow in this introduction. Well, Mary Wallace has ditched us all to go to Gatlinburg for her bachelorette weekend. The bum, no, I'm just kidding. So she asked me to come over and step in. I was like, well, I hadn't done this in a long time. So I'm happy to come over today and introduce Ruth and Aaron Martin as they discuss Habitat for Humanity, correct? So without further ado, I'll give you someone way more interesting to talk to you than myself. So let's have a little round of applause for Ruth and Aaron.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Can you all hear me? Good. This madness, or whatever you want to call it, all began in March of 1987. We were living in Pennsylvania at the time. I was teaching at a private high school, and to understand the circumstances, March in Pennsylvania is not the most delightful time of the year. Winter should be over, and it's not. It's sloppy, it's muddy, and it was in that context when friends, the wife of whom was on the board of the school where I was teaching, invited us to join them for a fundraising dinner. Now, ordinarily, a fundraising dinner has zero appeal to us, but the fundraising dinner was sponsored for Habitat for Humanity. The national director, Millard Fuller, was speaking at that fundraiser, and he described the Jimmy Carter house raising project in Charlotte of the summer of 1987. Frankly, what he said sounded crazy. Millard said that they were going to build 14 houses in 1 week in Charlotte. And Ruth and I looked at each other and we said, either this guy's crazy or they've got a good thing going for them. And we weren't sure how much longer we wanted to stay in Pennsylvania. So we said, well, you know what? We can afford to waste a week and sign up and find out. So we signed up. And our oldest and youngest son, Dan and Tim, decided to join us on this project in Charlotte. And something happened that almost made us back out. And I'll let Ruth tell you about what happened.
If any of you are a mother with a bunch of boys, you can understand this. Because they, well, let's just say I was not as adept at stuff and things being built as what 4 boys were. I hadn't enough fooling around with the 4 boys, let alone anything else. Well, the kids came home from college that day, that week. And the house we were living in was not all that great. But the boys looked around and they had been working with their uncle, my husband's younger brother, on their summer vacations in all kinds of construction stuff. And they said, Mom and Dad, that roof is really a mess. We've got to get that fixed. So we all had to get up and work on the roof. This was not my idea of a good idea. In fact, I was so spitless scared by the time one day was over that I said, no way. I am not going to go make a fool of myself in front of a whole bunch of people. You guys can go ahead, go take your thing, have a good time. I'm not going. The boys said, Mom, you have always told us that if we said we were going to do something, we would go and do it. Famous last words. So they shamed me into going, actually. And believe me, it was crazy. I wouldn't go from here to there on our own roof. But I said, well, maybe I can get somebody else to do that part. Anyway, the boys shamed me into going along, and Aaron can take it from there.
Well, there was a busload went from Lancaster County down to Charlotte in the summer of 1987 for the Carter Project. And frankly, except for our two boys, we didn't know other people who were on the bus. So we rode down, got to Charlotte, and frankly, I was wondering whether we'd see Jimmy Carter at all. And so we said, well, we'll go find out. Well, we got down there, and Ruth and I were assigned to the same house. Dick Soul, who's shown in the picture there, was the house leader for the particular house that we were on. He was from New England somewhere, and a great house leader. And so we started in. This was Sunday before the beginning of the project on Monday morning. Just looking at the site, and I'll show you the progress of the week. That's what the site looked like. Now keep in mind on these house blitz, while the work is done in a week, that's not quite correct because a lot of preparation is done ahead of time. Door frames, window headers, corners, tees, the floor plans laid out, a bunch of stuff like that. This again was Sunday afternoon. You see, people are not dressed for work there. And then Monday morning, we gathered after a brief devotion and started in. So there we are. That might be the house that we were working on, I'm not quite sure. Before we went there though, we were all housed in the college dorm of Queens College. It was not a fancy college dorm, it was an old-fashioned style of college dorm. All the guests were housed on one floor. There was a bathroom down the hall, and so on. And to our surprise, Millard and Linda Fuller, the national director, were housed in the room just across from us. And 7 rooms down, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter asked for nothing special. They stayed in the room with us as well. In fact, Ruth met Rosalind waiting in the line for the shower. So we started building. Oh, let me tell you about breakfast before we started building. We went down to the college cafeteria for breakfast. We went with another couple that we'd ridden down on the bus, sat down at a table for 8, and didn't think much about it until all of a sudden this guy comes in with a whole lot more energy than we had, plunks his tray right down beside me and says, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter from Georgia. Where are you folks from?" So was I going to meet Jimmy Carter? Boy, that was quite a meeting. And the funny aspect of that, when we were sitting there, our youngest son came for breakfast and spotted me. And you have to understand Tim, because when he was ready for construction, he would have slacks with the legs torn off, sleeves torn off the shirt, and so on. And he saw me, sat down beside me, and then, whoa, then he saw who was there as well. In fact, sometime later when Tim came down to visit, when we introduced Tim to the Carters, he says, "Oh yeah, I remember that guy without the shirt." No, he said with the shirt. It was quite the shirt. Anyway, first morning of Monday, walls are going up, and as you see, this is still on the first day, and in fact, by the end of the day, the roof trusses were up, and I think the roof was sheeted. We put up the siding and the trim on the end of the roof, and guess what? Guess who's on the roof there? After being afraid of being on the roof, Dick Soul was such a gentle teacher, and she's not right at the edge, but she was on the roof. So she got over that fear. The gang having a confab. This is probably about the Wednesday, perhaps. And we would stop periodically to review where we were at and what needed to be done. And it's progressing to the point where I'm putting up the door numbers. That's about what the street looked like. There were 14 houses that were being built. And there we are, Friday morning, they're digging up the ground to put in plantings. And the finished house, our house leader, Dick Soul, was right there beside me. And the Carters always went around and took a picture with everybody else. Our house, the wife of our house owner was quite short, so we built a small stool for her to use, and we all signed it, and Rosalind Carter also signed it. So, and there it is. By the end of the week, typically they're 2 or 3 bedrooms, and by the end of the week they are moving in the family. So indeed the house was finished, ready to move in by the end of the week. It was an amazing project. So Ruth is going to do a little reading.
Sorry about that. I only found out what I was supposed to do last night, so here we go. The first week in July, 1987, our family participated in what has to be one of the most uplifting experiences of our lives. We were not an official gathering of any kind. We joined with other volunteers from 28 states and 2 provinces in our first experiences in work with Habitat in Charlotte, North Carolina. We did not sit in a climate-controlled meeting in a convention center. Our session was climate-controlled, all right, by the blazing Carolina sun, an occasional merciful thunder shower. We didn't pass resolutions about the plight of the poor. We did something about it. And by the end of the week, 14 poor families were moved into simple but nice homes out of conditions that defy description for their squalor. Not only that, but those families knew how to maintain their new homes because they worked with us to build them. We didn't pass reservations about minority relations either. Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian soon acquire a very similar color as gallons of sweat mixed with the fine red Carolina clay in the 90-degree sun. We made no statements about brotherhood, but very wealthy and desperately poor people, and a good bit in between, manual workers, professional folks, people looking for work, and the family of the former US president, quickly became brothers and sisters with no thought of the status accompanied by the rest of the world. If you were willing to work, you were welcome. We made no pronouncements of unity, political or ecclesiastical, but we represented a variety of folks with one single united purpose. We had no air-conditioned accommodations, but the churches of Charlotte graciously had wound up enough fans so that each of us had one fan in a room in the college dormitory. All the volunteers shared the same conditions and got delightfully acquainted as a result. Aaron mentioned that I met Rosalind waiting in line for the shower, and it just was that way. It was like a bunch of college kids. Some of the folks sharing in the daily devotional period or some of the evening programs were officially preachers. Some were public officials. Some were new homeowners. Some were contractors. Didn't matter. And we heard some of the best, most genuine, most practical preaching that we ever heard. We made no pronouncements on evangelism or faithfulness or anything else. We just demonstrated the good news in a way that people could see the reality of a shared life. A Jewish reporter who became a close friend confided that she was apprehensive about being assigned to cover an overtly Christian affair. But she spoke of being so warmly received that she was amazed. And that same reporter produced an enthusiastic article about our women's house build several years later. We didn't talk about the Lord. We just tried to obey what he said and take care of the poor. Best of all, yielding a mountain of paperwork and high-sounding goals, our week ended by moving those families into the first decent home of their entire lives.
As I said, we were placed in the dormitory right across from Millard and Linda Fuller. Having been a teacher for quite a number of years, one of the things that I have recognized is that the biggest challenge in teaching is motivating kids. If kids are turned on, you can do anything with them. And in that context, one evening in the dormitory, after a day's work, I said to Millard, Millard, have you ever considered bringing educators into the Habitat communities to capitalize on the momentum of a new house? His reply as we discovered was characteristic of Millard, he said, "That's a great idea. Why don't you come down to the headquarters and do it?" Well, I was eligible for a sabbatical leave, and so the following year, we sold our house and spent the sabbatical year with Habitat. So, in the school year of 1988-89, we sold our house, and this was our home. That Yugo, which by the way served us quite well at the time, that was our home. We didn't have any other house. We set off and started on the building project for the year. So where did it begin? We drove ourselves. We first drove to New England, to Lawrence, Massachusetts. This was the 12th anniversary of Habitat, and to celebrate, they were going to do a 1,200-mile walk from Maine to Georgia. And in the process, they were going to build 120 houses and then do the house raising, the build along the way. Well, we're not gimmicky, walking people to raise money. If you want to ask us for money, ask us. We don't have to have you walk somewhere. If we think it's worth giving to, we'll give it to you. You don't have to walk 5 miles or 1,200 miles or anything like that. So we started, and we were part of the building crew. There were walkers. We would start, well, I'll show you what happened. There in Lawrence, Massachusetts, we were doing 2-story units, very quickly accomplishing. Then our next stop was in Paterson, New Jersey, which wasn't a very great spot, but it worked. And we built there for a week. We were in Lawrence for 2 weeks, in Paterson for 1 week. From Paterson, we moved on to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we were rehabbing old houses. It was crazy because the architect's design said there was supposed to be space for all of this, and it turns out the apartment wasn't wide enough, so we had to do fudging. We had to do fudging a number of places, but it worked. Then we went on to Pittman, New Jersey. And by the way it worked, the carpenters would drive ahead, build a house. Generally, we didn't finish it, but we had it framed so that it looked like it finished. The walkers would walk into town. We'd have a dedication of the house. We would then leapfrog ahead and go to the next place and build the house and so on, all the way. In Pittman, the foundation wasn't even finished, so we had to lay some block. That was the family that was getting the house in Pittman. From Pittman, we went on to Chapel Hill, and there were a couple of houses being built in Chapel Hill. It's kind of interesting because the house leader, the leader of the project in Chapel Hill, was so amazed he didn't think women could drive a nail. Well, guess what? A few of them showed him up on that one. In fact, one time he was standing around saying, "Well, I guess you really can drive a nail." So, anyway, the construction, it was prefab site units that we set in place. And guess who's on the roof? She got rid of the fear of being on the roof. In fact, photographers and press could hardly avoid Ruth because a woman with a hammer And she preferred skirts to some of the other, and they just hit her like fleas on a dog, I guess. On to Richmond. We spent a week in Chapel Hill, a week in Richmond, and then back to Charlotte. We spent 2 weeks in Charlotte. Charlotte built several houses that summer in the 12th anniversary. One of the homeowners, future homeowners, and then on to Rock Hill. The summer in Charlotte was quite hot. In fact, one day it was really hot, and I was up on the roof working away, and all of a sudden I started to feel cold, and it was practically up to 100 and being on the roof. I said, I don't think that's quite what it should be. So I got down, sat in the shade for a while, and nothing serious had happened. In Rock Hill, again, the paneling was sandwiched styrofoam with wood on the outside. There's the roofing taking place in York. And then the final 2 weeks were in Clarksville, Georgia for us. After hot summer, being up in the elevation of Clarksville was quite delightful. We even were rehabbing one house. I've never seen anything like it. Frankly, the house should have had a match to it rather than trying to rehab it. That house, on the wallpaper, termites had eaten the design. There was a certain part of the wallpaper that they liked, but other part they didn't. So there was a ruffled design all throughout the wallpaper. But we also worked in the new house there as well. And after the hot summer, we were at the high elevation in a delightful cabin owned by, this was, I forget the guy's, he was an architect for a lot of the big buildings down in Atlanta. But it was delightful to work there for those 2 weeks. And of course, you always met new people. And finally, at the end, there was the march into Atlanta after the end of the 1,200 miles. They put the carpenters in the front. There were only about 8 or so of us that had built all summer long. There were many people joined for a week or two, but there were a few of us that had gone the whole way, and we led the march into Atlanta, where they had the final celebration. So why do we do anything like that? I said already that you couldn't pay me to do that kind of work. It was way too hard and so on. So if I couldn't be paid to do it, why would I do it? Well, guess what? This is one of the houses that people were living in down there. And so was this. And notice that one faucet? That was the water supply for 4 or 5 houses. There was no water in the house. This mother and son were living in that house. We got into some of those houses. You didn't have to worry about sweeping the floor because there were cracks through the floor. You could just move the dirt around and it would fall through the floor. So they were moved from this house into this one. What a contrast. Not elaborate, but very simple, very adequate, very nice. So we were down at the headquarters in Americus, Georgia. And that was shortly after we got there. So what did we do at the headquarters for the rest of the school year after the walk was over? By the way, this was the house we lived in. And for us, it was rather delightful. You would hear the squirrels bowling in the roof of the attic with pecans. When we wanted to take a bath or a shower, the ants would actually take their dead, dump them in the bathtub. So you'd have to rinse out the bathtub. But hey, it worked. So it was fine with us. And that was our house. This was the first, well, it's the house we lived in. This was the first house that Habitat had rehabilitated, and it was in need of some additional rehabilitation by this time. This was the community. The place where we were living was right on the edge. I'll let Ruth tell you about Hattie.
Hattie had been one of the early recipients of a Habitat house before we ever got there. And she was a most delightful person, and it was from her that I learned how you're supposed to behave around a community like that. Although we let's just say we didn't quite go up to what most people's standards were, because Hattie was my boss in the program for the local Habitat people, of whom there were probably 30 to 50. There were 50 houses in Americus, near where the building was. There were about 50 houses that had already been rehabbed and were then being lived in by community members. And Hattie was one of these. And she took it upon herself to teach me how you're supposed to behave in that kind of a setting, which was most delightful. And especially when we went together to a store or any kind of a business place to get something, try to get something donated for our work. And we took most delight in going to a rather snooty type store owner, and he would, of course, immediately talk to me about what I thought needed to be done. And I just smiled and I said, well, I'll have to check with my supervisor about that, which of course was Hattie. And we had a wonderful time just making monkeys out of a lot of the high-powered people in town. But I did learn a lot of wonderful things from Hattie about how things were done in a small southern town. I'd grown up in Washington, D.C., and I didn't know squat. But Hattie was a really totally wonderful person. She taught me so much. But there was one thing she never taught me, and I was very upset with her because Hattie could do something to cook collards like nothing I had ever seen. And I kept saying, Hattie, look, you've taught me so many things. You could certainly told me what you do. It's just she sat him going all day long to get it made. She said, honey, you've just gotta remember that you gotta be born this way, or you're never gonna be able to make collards. And she would not tell me, and I still don't know what she put in them. But the delight of people that supposedly weren't supposed to be, you know, we put everything kept caught before the horse, and that's also fun to do, especially when you get snooty people up against you.
We did a lot of things with the kids in the community, made some stuffed animals. Our son was down for a bit, helped. Ruth helped women do some sewing classes. They made bathrooms for themselves. The big program, though, was a reading program. We visited all 50 of the Habitat homes, and as we went from house to house, the one thing that amazed us is we never saw books in the Habitat houses. Our kids grew up cutting their teeth on books, and for families not to have books around the house seemed very strange. We finally figured out why it doesn't happen. A lot of the parents never knew how to read. So if the parents couldn't read, why would they buy books for their kids? So we said, we'd start doing some checking, and we said, why don't we develop a reading program for the kids? And the reading program we set up so that the kids would read to an adult. And by coming to the sessions, reading to an adult, not the adult reading to them, the kids read to the adult, and by doing that, they could earn books of their own to keep. So a lot of we visited all the schools and so on, and they were enthusiastic about our working on this kind of a project. Yeah, there were some benefactors who bought the books for us, so that the first, if they came 2 or 3 times, they got a book fairly easily the first time, then it was a little longer till they'd get the next one. But in the process, they earned quite a number of books. Well, we resisted going to the Carter's church for a long time, but finally, when it was no longer tourist season, we started visiting, and we went to Maranatha Church and met the Carters. Sunday morning was tourist time, but Sunday evening was the local people. We got to know the Carters somewhat well, and they volunteered to come and assist in the reading program. What we did is would have someone come in, speak about their work, because a lot of the families didn't have much employment. So we'd have someone speak about their work, and then interact with the kids in that kind of way. So here's Jimmy and Rosalind sitting down, listening to the kids read. Jimmy's sitting with a kid, Rosalind with a kid, and afterward we invited them to our house for supper, and we'll tell you more about that in the next session when we concentrate on the Carters. Well, that was our year with Habitat. After the year was over, back to Pennsylvania for a year, but started going to a number of other Habitat projects. In 1990, we went back to, the Carter project was in Tijuana, Mexico. They were building 100 houses, and again, it was foam construction, covered with cement. In the meantime, we were going back and forth regularly to Charlotte, and Charlotte kind of adapted us, and so we every year went back to Charlotte to help build some more houses. That was one of the fellows I was working with. That was our accommodation. We slept in tents, and our showers, there was a black plastic bag that you laid in the sun to heat up, and you shared that for a shower. I don't remember exactly where we took our showers, but that was our accommodation. In 91, this was the celebration at the end of the Carter project in Tijuana. In 91, we went to Miami Again, there was foam construction. They sprayed stucco on the surface. And yeah, that's what the houses looked like. We'll come back to this, but after going to Charlotte regularly, on one occasion they decided to build a house in 24 hours. It was a crazy blitz, but it happened. And at the end, everything's laid out ahead of time, so it's kind of like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle. But at the end of that 100th house, we were sitting around and saying, okay, after that 24-hour blitz, what do you do for an encore? And one of the women said, you know, I'll bet we'd have enough talent to do one with all women. And the girls jumped on it like crazy. And Ruth will tell you more about that later. But in DC, after the first women's build, Ruth participated in an all-women's build. And in fact, she's on the roof. And you want to tell them about what happened with Secret Service when the Secret Service came by.
This is just a short one, but after we had done the women's house in Charlotte, the Carter Project houses were spotted all over the country. They decided to do one in DC. And so we signed up to go along, and we we joined one women's house among the whole works of the Carter Project. And people in Washington tend to get a little bent out of shape about important people. And so the Secret Service wandered around among the houses to make sure everything was all on the up and up. And everybody had to come down. Well, I don't know what I was doing, but I missed the instruction. And I was up on the roof when the Carters walked through the area. And I apologize. Somebody said, hey, we were supposed to get off the roof for this. And one of the Secret Service guys took one look. He said, oh, we don't worry about her. We know her. She won't bother anybody.
So that was DC. In 1993, we were in Winnipeg. I don't have any pictures of that. One of the most amazing experiences was in 1994 when we went to Eagle Butte, North Dakota, Eagle Butte, South Dakota, for a Carter Project there. Since I had time, we went 2 weeks early in preparation for it. So here we are welcoming to Eagle Butte. We met Gilbert on Eagle Butte, and Ruth. Gilbert taught us so much. The 3 weeks there, we learned so much, but we learned that we know almost nothing, because the insight of the Sioux Indians, I think you'd have to spend the best part of a lifetime to fully understand it. There is one rather amazing thing that we were taught. Did you know in the Black Hills there are 5 faces, not 4? On the left side, facing the 4 presidents, is an Indian chief in full headdress. When the Sioux Indians saw that, and by the way, there are better pictures from different perspectives, but I don't have the better. But if you look at it the right perspective, you can clearly see the Indian chief. And when they saw that, it was reassurance to them that they wouldn't be wiped out and that their culture would be preserved. 95, we went to, well, let me show you a little bit of Eagle Butte. In the preparation ahead of time, basements there. Thunderstorms came in periodically, mercifully, and we learned about storms from Gilbert that I still don't understand. Ruth was back on the roof without any fear by this time, doing the siding, pretty much what the community was looking like toward the end of the week. I think we built 30 houses there in that week. In 95, we were back to Los Angeles. In 99, we went to Kentucky. I don't have pictures from that. We had a reunion blitz in Phoenix, and our last habitat project was in Anniston, Anniston, Alabama, in 2003. 2004, we built our own house. After all this work, Ruth said, we ought to build our own house. I thought we'd probably kill each other if we tried it, but our youngest son was habitat supervisor here in Greensboro. We made him boss, and the project went quite good. We were hoping to stay there until our death. Well, it didn't happen. We also worked on a lot of other habitat projects, and Fuller Center in western Alabama. This particular project in Anniston was the only one that we worked on with the Carters themselves. But let us conclude with a brief presentation about the women's build, and I'll let Ruth tell you about that.
After our friends in Charlotte yeah. After the big to-do over their 100th house in Charlotte, a bunch of us were sitting, well, when we got back from being in Americas, Charlotte sort of adopted us because we'd been going back and forth all the time. We were living in Upland, but we were in Jamestown, and but we went back and forth all the time. Whenever they were doing something, they would always let us know. And we were sitting around after the celebration of the house that they were going to build in 24 hours. Everything, when they do that, everything is like in neat little piles. You know where everything is. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle. But we were sitting around congratulating ourselves on having gotten all ready to go in one 24-hour period. And one of the girls said, you know, I bet we've got, after this, what are we going to do for an encore? And one of the girls said, you know, I bet that with this talent we have here, we could do one with all girls. Well, we all jumped on it and put it together, and it happened. This is Is that the one that Charlotte, yeah, we brought our one daughter-in-law down, and everybody did their own thing, but in the we had just come back from America, so that's what would happen. And I said, you know, I bet if we do this, I bet Rosalind would come and help. And so they jumped on me to write to her, and I did, and she came also. And then our daughter-in-law and little Katie were there for our family contribution. But we had a wonderful time, and we made it. And it's gone other places in the country now, but Charlotte was the first to do, well, almost all women. We had to have the county building inspector. And so, just for anyhow, he wore a wig, a big mop. And if you've done any construction work or those kinds of places, you know about the little house they put beside the work they're doing. Well, there was one little spot in that little outhouse that we didn't need, being all women. So we put their little pot in a flower. Those were the three grandmas in the women's house, Rosalind and me and the one of the women from Charlotte. I don't know how these things work. How do I get the next one? There's a bunch of the people working on the house, bunch of the girls working on the house. There's nothing different about that one. You don't have a, there's the outhouse. That's where we had a geranium growing. Is that, why don't you just tell them, because I don't know what you want. Okay. One of the girls who had worked as a contractor we weren't sure how we were going to get, you build the roof trusses on the ground, and then you have to get them up where they belong. And we weren't sure we were going to be able to do that. But this one girl who had worked for a contractor, had her own business, I think. Didn't Clara have her own business? And she figured out a way, laying on the ground, to put ropes on all the points. And, crank sort of thing that she just pulled them up neat as can be. It was no problem at all. And Linda Fuller came, Millard's wife, for the dedication of the house.
Well, that is our Habitat experience. Does anybody have any questions about our Habitat experience? You can ask us more. There's Ruth took her t-shirts that she was given, made a quilt out of it. There's also some books up front. So if you want to see any of that, you're certainly welcome to do it. Thanks for joining us for the Habitat Year, and next time in April we'll tell you more about our experience with the Carters. Thank you.